players. Four players that the Indiana Fever should core to make sure that no team can touch.
3 players, 3 Indiana Fever players who were supposed to be the cornerstones of everything. Music, the established identity for a franchise starving for a fresh beginning, erased just music like that. No formal announcement from the front office. No heartfelt farewell post. 3 lockers emptied in the dead of night as if they had never existed at all. This music wasn't a trade. This wasn't a calculated move for a better draft position. This was surgery performed without warning. And the message was brutally, devastatingly clear. We were told this was a rebuild. Nobody told us the first thing they would demolish was the locker room itself. Music. And you need to understand this because it's the part that disappears in the box scores and the win-loss records when you erase the leadership of 3 players like this. You don't just lose bodies on a roster. You lose the memory of what winning actually feels like. You lose the toughness built over hundreds of brutal games. You lose the quiet conversations on the team bus that settle a rookie's anxiety after a crushing loss. You lose the player who knows how to silence a panicking huddle with a single glance. You lose the one who organizes the team dinners on the road. You lose the institutional knowledge that cannot be taught in a film room or drawn up on a whiteboard. The Fever didn't receive a first-round pick for this. They didn't gain cap space that changes anything right now. They got a gaping wound in their culture and a thundering music, deafening silence from the general manager's office. A silence that communicates more than any press conference ever could. A silence that is in itself a declaration of absolute, terrifying authority. Now look around. The entire WNBA media world is a 5-alarm emergency. Every sports radio host in Indianapolis is fielding calls from furious, bewildered fans. The phone lines lit up like a Christmas tree soaked in gasoline. Every national commentator is scrambling to assemble the pieces, bumping their scheduled segments to lead with this story. The official narrative is already being packaged and distributed through cooperative media channels. Bold decisions for a new era, establishing a culture of accountability, moving forward. But you and I, we know that's the script. That's the press release talking. What if the game being played on the hardwood at Gainbridge Fieldhouse was never actually the real game? What if the frantic timeouts, the bewildering substitutions, the scorching and freezing streaks? What if all of that was simply the visible symptom of a private infection? A sickness rotting deep inside the core of the organization, far from the cameras, far music from the fans. A battle for the very identity of the team that had been raging long before the first player was cut. A war conducted in whispers in the tunnel, sharp glances traded across the practice floor, music, and in sealed-door meetings where loyalty was commanded, not cultivated. For months, if you understood how to listen, the warnings were already there. Not in the headlines. They were in the whispers. They were in the silences between sentences. Beat reporters, the ones who travel alongside the team, the ones who encounter players at baggage claim and in hotel corridors, began leaving breadcrumbs. A cryptic post after a loss, not referencing the game, but suggesting some things run deeper than basketball. A sentence buried at the bottom of a game recap about a fractured locker room struggling to find a collective voice. A coach in Christie's sides who would warmly and lavishly praise one group of players for their commitment and dedication while offering clipped, almost dismissive single-word responses about others. A general manager, the legendary Lynn Dunn, who had become a permanent fixture at practices, a phantom hovering along the sidelines, her focus not on the drills but on the dynamics, watching who engaged with whom, studying who held eye contact, reading body language, measuring loyalty. To the fan watching at home on television, it just appeared to be a young team discovering itself. You see a blown assignment and music. You think they'll correct it next possession. You see a tense huddle and you read it as competitive fire. That is the story they need you to accept. Music. We are constructing something meaningful. These things require patience to develop. You have to trust the process. Music. But for anyone who has spent real time inside a professional locker room, the signals were impossible to miss. These weren't cracks in the foundation. These were seismic faults preparing to tear the entire structure to the ground. and they widened with every single defeat, and even more terrifyingly with every single victory that seemed to reward only one side of a fractured team. The on-court product became a weekly vote on who actually held the power. It was baffling to witness. One quarter the Fever would look like genuine contenders. The offense humming, passes moving with intention, every player operating in harmony, a stunning symphony of basketball executed to perfection. You'd catch Christie Sides on the sideline clapping, nodding. Music. That look of, this is it. This is what all the work has been building toward. And then after halftime, an entirely different team would emerge wearing the exact same jerseys. It was pure disorder. 5 individuals running 5 completely separate agendas. You'd see careless transition defense surrendering an uncontested layup, and the broadcast camera would find 2 players assigning blame to one another while a third simply stared vacantly at the jumbotron. You'd spot a star player visibly open on the wing, hammering their fist in frustration as a younger teammate forced a contested shot that rattled off the rim. You'd watch a veteran yanked at the 5-minute mark of a tight fourth quarter and never return to the floor, left to simmer on the bench in silence. The timeouts became essential viewing, not for the tactical adjustments, but for what the body language revealed. The eye rolls, the collapsed shoulders, the 1,000-yard stares, as a coach diagrammed a play that absolutely everyone understood was not going to be executed because the trust simply was not there. The post-game. Interviews transformed from sports analysis into amateur therapy sessions. Music. Christie Sides would approach the podium and speak entirely in code. Words like professionalism, commitment, being a good teammate, those aren't basketball terms. Those are culture war terms. When a coach abandons conversations about X's and O's music and pivots to discussions about character, you understand the problems have traveled far beyond the playbook. And the players, they would give you absolutely nothing, just recycled cliches. Got to be better. Got to execute. On to the next one. Music. Their faces, however, delivered the unfiltered truth. The frustration was suffocating. Music. The exhaustion wasn't physical. It was psychological. They were depleted from the battle that continued long after the final buzzer sounded. The one that carried real consequences. Because behind sealed doors, a civil war was detonating. Sources close to the team describe a locker room that had splintered not into 2 factions, but 3. It was a quiet, frozen fracture. First, you had the system soldiers. These were the players, typically younger or recently arrived, who were completely devoted to the Lynn Dunn and Christie Sides blueprint for the future. Music. They delivered exactly what was requested the moment it was requested. They executed the plays as designed. They defended the scheme without hesitation, and they were compensated with minutes and public validation. They were the organization's tomorrow, and they understood that completely. And they were deliberate about never stepping outside the boundaries. Then you had the skeptics, the established players, the ones carrying resumes, the ones who had inhabited winning locker rooms and genuinely understood the complexity of a grinding professional season. They didn't oppose the objective of winning, but they challenged the rigid, inflexible methodology. They believed multiple roads existed toward a championship. They would propose adjustments during film sessions, identifying precisely how opposing teams were dismantling their schemes. Music. They would challenge a defensive approach that was visibly being exploited, not out of defiance, but because their accumulated experience signaled it was a path to defeat. Music. They weren't being insubordinate. They were being professionals. In a functional culture, that tension is productive energy. Here it was interpreted as a direct challenge to authority. And finally, trapped in the crossfire, you had the bridge builders. These were the players who commanded the genuine respect of both factions simultaneously. They attempted to mediate. They worked to translate coach language for the skeptics and communicate veteran concerns back to the coaching staff. They fought to preserve open lines of dialogue, continuously reminding everyone that they were all theoretically pulling in the same direction. Music. But within this particular environment, neutrality was weaponized as weakness. The middle ground had become quicksand, music, and they were sinking rapidly, emotionally hollowed out from attempting to hold together a team that seemed absolutely committed to destroying itself. Every single practice session, every film review, every team meeting felt less like battle preparation and more like a loyalty examination. Whose side do you occupy? the system, or your teammates. The pressure was suffocating, and it was hurtling toward its inevitable detonation. And then came the explosion. The first, music, cut. It didn't arrive on a quiet Monday when organizations typically conduct their business. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, music, mere hours after a devastating, soul-crushing defeat on their home floor. A key rotation player, a locker room cornerstone, someone universally admired for their relentless work ethic and their authentic voice. Suddenly, without a single warning, waved. Gone. No preceding injury. No public confrontation. No circulating trade whispers. It was a public execution. The objective wasn't roster improvement. The objective was to deliver an unmistakable message to every single person still cashing a check from that organization. The message landed with the weight of a demolition ball. Your perspective is not welcome in this building. Your experience carries no currency here. Your questions represent a liability. Fall in line, silence yourself, and music. Perform exactly as instructed or you are next. The conversation was finished. The purge had commenced. It was swift. It was merciless. 72 hours later, the second name disappeared. Another respected player, someone celebrated for their unfiltered honesty in team meetings. Music. And 1 week after that, the third, the final fragment of the dissenting core surgically extracted. This wasn't trimming excess. This wasn't manufacturing space for an incoming prospect. This was a systematic demolition of a specific philosophy within the roster. This was the deliberate elimination of any voice that wasn't the voice echoing from the front office. Anyone who had ever introduced an alternative viewpoint in a huddle. Anyone who had ever asked why in a film session instead of simply nodding in submission. Anyone whose body language broadcasted visible frustration during a losing stretch. One by one they were identified, isolated, and removed from the equation. It was an unambiguous demonstration of absolute institutional power, engineered specifically to drive the surviving players into total, unquestioning obedience. And for the players left standing amid the wreckage of their locker room, the transmission was received with perfect clarity. Every single one of you is replaceable. And if you believe you missed the evidence of this fracture, I am telling you directly. You simply weren't examining the correct locations. The proof wasn't buried inside a bombshell investigative report. It existed in the 1,000 tiny lacerations inflicted upon the team's culture over months. You simply had to pay attention. You'd observe post-game meals where the seating arrangements were divided not by position, but by allegiance. The younger players and coaches clustered at one end, the established veterans seated in near total silence at the opposite side. You could witness it across social media. Music. Players who once enthusiastically amplified each other before every single game went completely silent. The pre-game encouragement posts evaporated. Music. The celebratory Instagram stories disappeared entirely. It was a digital deep freeze that communicated everything words refused to say. Watch the pre-game warm-ups. The elaborate handshake rituals that players had constructed together over years. Gone, replaced by perfunctory head nods. The energy, the joy, music. The brotherhood and sisterhood that serves as the lifeblood of every successful team. It had been completely evacuated from the building, replaced by a suffocating, clinical formality. It was the body language of people who were no longer teammates, but co-workers punching a clock at a job they were quietly beginning to despise. Walking on eggshells, terrified of uttering the wrong words to the wrong person. Music. So now we arrive at the question. The one that nobody inside the Indiana front office has any desire to answer. The one that every single fan should be screaming at the top of their lungs. Is Lynn Dunn a visionary architect executing the brutal but unavoidable decisions required to construct a dynasty? Or is she engineering a monument dedicated entirely to her own authority? Is this a championship culture being hammered and tempered in fire? Or is it an institutional dictatorship demanding music, absolute, unconditional submission? Because there exists a fundamental and undeniable distinction between holding players to an elite standard and manufacturing a cult of compliance. Accountability. Music. Genuine accountability operates as a two-way highway. It travels from the players upward to the coaches, and it flows from the coaches back down to the players. What we are currently witnessing in Indiana is a one-way road with no exits. Music. It is a top-down, my way or the highway philosophy that suffocates dissent and deliberately misidentifies it as weakness. And the history of professional sports is absolutely littered with the ruins of franchises that attempted to function exactly this way. It never concludes with a championship parade. It never concludes with a banner ascending into the rafters. It concludes with a franchise cornerstone demanding a trade out of desperation. It concludes with an arena that echoes with empty seats. It concludes with a general manager delivering their own tearful exit interview. If this is the category of deep, unfiltered, no-punches-pulled WNBA analysis you have been searching for, the variety of coverage that reaches beyond the box score and exposes what is genuinely unfolding behind closed doors, then do yourself a favor. Absolutely demolish that like button. Click subscribe so you never miss a single moment. And make sure you ring that notification bell because I can guarantee you the fallout from this implosion has barely begun. Music. And you are going to want a front row seat when the remainder of this story fully detonates. Let me know in the comments. Was this a necessary purge or were these foundational pieces? I want to hear from you. The established presence for a franchise desperate for a new dawn, erased just like that. No formal declaration from the front office. No emotional farewell post. 3 lockers emptied in the dead of night as if they had never occupied that space at all. This wasn't a trade. This wasn't a calculated maneuver for a superior draft selection. This was an amputation performed without anesthetic. And the message was brutally, terrifyingly unambiguous. We were told this was a rebuild. Music. Nobody informed us the very first structure they would demolish was the locker room itself. And you need to internalize this because music. It is the component that evaporates inside the box scores and the win-loss columns when you erase the leadership of 3 players in one sweeping motion. You don't simply lose bodies populating a music roster. You lose the memory of what winning genuinely demands. You lose the toughness accumulated across hundreds of punishing games. You lose the quiet exchanges on the team plane that stabilize a rookie's composure after a devastating performance. You lose the player who understands how to settle a panicking huddle with nothing more than a single composed look. You lose the one who coordinates the team dinners on the road. You lose the institutional wisdom that cannot be replicated in a film session or diagrammed onto a whiteboard. The Fever didn't receive a first-round pick in exchange for this sacrifice. They didn't acquire cap flexibility that carries any immediate relevance. They received a cavernous wound in their organizational culture and a thunderously echoing silence emanating from the general manager's office. A silence that communicates volumes beyond anything a press conference could ever deliver. A silence that is in itself an unmistakable declaration of absolute, terrifying institutional power. Music. Now survey the landscape. The entire WNBA media ecosystem is a 5-alarm emergency. Every sports radio personality in Indianapolis is fielding calls from furious, bewildered fans. The phone lines illuminated like a Christmas tree soaked in gasoline. Every national commentator is frantically assembling the fragments, abandoning their scheduled segments to lead with this singular story. The approved narrative is already being packaged and distributed through sympathetic media pipelines. Difficult decisions for a new era, constructing a culture of accountability, pressing forward. But you and I, we recognize that for exactly what it is. That is the script. That is the press release recited verbatim. What if the game being contested on the hardwood at Gainbridge Fieldhouse was never the authentic game? What if the frantic timeouts, the disorienting substitutions, the burning and freezing performances? What if every single one of those was merely the visible symptom of a deeply private illness? A sickness festering at the core of the organization, concealed from the cameras, concealed far music from the fanbase. A battle for the fundamental soul of the franchise that had been raging intensely long before the first player was ever cut. A war conducted in hushed voices inside the tunnel, sharp meaningful glances exchanged across the practice floor, music, and inside sealed meetings where loyalty was commanded, music, never organically cultivated. For months, if you possessed the knowledge of how to truly listen, the alarms were already sounding. Not within the headlines. They resided in the whispers. They lived in the deliberate spaces between spoken words. Beat reporters, the ones who journey alongside the team, the ones who encounter players at baggage claim and in hotel corridors, began scattering breadcrumbs across the path. A cryptic post following a defeat, addressing nothing about the actual game, but hinting that certain things extend far beyond basketball. A sentence buried at the absolute bottom of a game recap referencing music. A fractured locker room incapable of discovering a collective identity. A coach in Christie's sides who would lavishly and enthusiastically celebrate one group of players for their dedication and total commitment while producing clipped, single-syllable music. Nearly dismissive responses when questioned about others. A general manager, the legendary Lynn Dunn, who had materialized as a permanent fixture at practice sessions, a phantom presence lingering along the sideline, her attention directed not at the drills unfolding before her, but at the interpersonal dynamics, cataloging who engaged with whom, monitoring who maintained eye contact, decoding body language, quietly measuring loyalty. Music. To the supporter watching from their living room on television, it presented itself as nothing more than a young team discovering its identity. You observe a missed assignment and you conclude they will correct it on the following possession. You witness a tense huddle and you interpret it as raw competitive fire burning brightly. That is the precise narrative they require you to accept. We are constructing something meaningful here. These processes require time to develop properly. You must trust the direction we are heading. But for any individual who has genuinely inhabited a professional locker room, music, the indicators were absolutely impossible to ignore. These were not surface cracks in a sturdy foundation. These were seismic fractures preparing to violently tear the entire structure apart from its roots. And they expanded with every single defeat, and even more chillingly with every single victory that appeared to exclusively validate one entrenched faction of the team. The on-court product evolved into a weekly referendum determining who genuinely controlled the franchise. It was utterly baffling to observe. One quarter the Fever would perform like legitimate world beaters. The offense flowing.